Welcome to the channel, Crime Behind You. Today's story takes us to the year 1859 and follows Seraphina Drake, an enslaved black girl whose beauty proved to be a curse. The mistress could not stand the attention Seraphina drew, and what she did next was cruelty beyond measure. For 10 long years, she kept her chained and hidden away. This story is difficult and intense, so take a moment, breathe, and listen closely. Before we begin, be sure to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps ensure these stories are remembered, not buried. Let's begin. In the spring of 1859, in a small cabin behind the Whitmore plantation in Warren County, Mississippi, a baby girl was born with amber-colored eyes and skin that seemed to glow even in dim candlelight. Her mother, a field slave named Ruth, looked at her newborn daughter and felt something she had rarely known in her 32 years of bondage: fear. But it was not the ordinary fear of the overseer's whip or the master's temper. This was a different terror. With an instinct only a mother possesses, Ruth understood that her daughter's extraordinary beauty would become either a salvation or a destruction. She named the child Seraphina, after the highest order of angels, a word she had heard the plantation mistress read years earlier from a book of religious poetry. Ruth could not read or write, but she never forgot that word. Seraphina, the burning ones, the angels closest to God. She whispered it into her daughter's ear that first night, praying that heaven might protect what she knew she could not. The Whitmore plantation stretched across 1,800 acres of the richest cotton land in the Mississippi Delta. The main house stood on a gentle rise overlooking the fields, a 2-story Greek Revival mansion with white columns and wide verandas that seemed to mock the suffering that made its grandeur possible. In 1859, the plantation held 147 enslaved people and produced nearly 500 bales of cotton each year, making the Whitmore family one of the wealthiest in the region. The master was Colonel James Whitmore, 63 years old, who prided himself on running what he called a tight operation. He rarely visited the slave quarters, leaving daily management to his overseers and his wife. James Whitmore spent most of his time in Vicksburg, attending to business and politics. He had served in the Mississippi state legislature and considered himself a gentleman of the highest order. He owned human beings as casually as he owned horses or furniture, never questioning the morality of the institution that made him rich. But the true power in the Whitmore household resided not with the colonel, but with his wife, Helena. In 1859 she was 41, once considered the most beautiful debutante in Natchez society. Time and disappointment had hardened her features and poisoned her heart. She had given her husband 3 sons, all of whom survived to adulthood, and she saw this as her greatest accomplishment. Yet Helena Whitmore lived with a secret bitterness that colored everything. She watched her beauty fade in the mirror each morning, in the fine lines around her eyes and the slight loosening of her jaw, and she could not bear it. Helena ruled the domestic slaves with an iron hand. She personally supervised the house servants, cooks, laundresses, and nursemaids. Nothing escaped her notice. She prided herself on maintaining what she called proper order, complete submission from every enslaved person inside her home. The field slaves answered to the overseers, the house slaves answered to Helena. And Helena answered to no one. For the first 7 years of her life, Seraphina lived in relative obscurity. She stayed with her mother in the small cabin behind the main house, where Ruth worked as a laundress. The work was brutal. Ruth spent 14 hours a day washing, boiling, and pressing the fine linens and clothing of the Whitmore family. Her hands bore permanent scars from lye soap and scalding water. But she kept her daughter close, teaching her to stay quiet, stay invisible, stay alive. Seraphina learned these lessons well. She helped carry water from the well and sort dirty laundry. She learned to fold sheets without a single wrinkle, to walk softly, to speak only when spoken to, and never to look a white person directly in the eye. These were the rules of survival every enslaved child absorbed before understanding their meaning. But there was one thing Ruth could not teach her daughter to hide: the light that seemed to radiate from Seraphina's face. By the time the girl turned 7, her beauty had become impossible to ignore. Her amber eyes shifted from deep gold to honey brown with the light. Her features were perfectly symmetrical, high cheekbones, a delicate chin. Her skin was flawless, a deep brown that seemed to hold warmth even in cold weather. And when she smiled, which was rare, the effect was startling. The other enslaved people noticed first. They whispered among themselves, some in admiration, some in warning. Old Bessie, who worked in the kitchen and claimed the gift of sight, told Ruth, "Keep that child hidden. That kind of pretty brings nothing but trouble. Either the men will want her or the women will hate her. Either way, it ends in blood." Ruth tried. She kept Seraphina in the cabin as much as possible, dressed her in shapeless clothes, rubbed dirt on her face, wrapped her hair tight under rough cloth. But beauty like Seraphina's could no more be concealed than the sun hidden behind a handkerchief. It shone through everything. The day that changed everything came in September 1859. The summer heat had broken, and Helena Whitmore decided to walk through the domestic work areas for one of her unannounced inspections. She appeared without warning to criticize work and remind everyone of their place. That afternoon, she passed the laundry area just as Seraphina emerged from the cabin carrying a basket of folded linens. The girl didn't see the mistress approaching. She was focused on balancing the heavy basket. The cloth had slipped from her head, and her hair fell in soft waves around her face. The afternoon sun caught her at just the right angle, illuminating her features with a golden light. Helena Whitmore stopped walking. She stood perfectly still for several seconds, staring at the child with an expression witnesses later struggled to describe. It was not exactly anger, it was something deeper, more dangerous. It was the look of a woman confronting something she could not accept. Ruth saw the mistress and felt her blood turn to ice. She dropped the shirt she was wringing and rushed toward her daughter, but she was too late. Helena had already seen. And what she saw, she could never unsee. That night, Helena lay awake in her canopied bed while her husband snored beside her. She could not stop thinking about the slave girl. She could not stop comparing. When she closed her eyes, she saw those amber irises and that perfect skin, and she felt a rage building inside her that frightened even herself. How dare this child, this piece of property, possess what Helena was losing? How dare she exist at all? By morning, Helena had made her decision. She told herself it was about discipline, about maintaining proper order. She told herself the girl had been insolent, had failed to show proper respect, had looked at her with defiance. None of this was true. But Helena repeated it until she almost believed it. The truth, which she would never admit, even in her own mind, was simpler: she could not bear to look at Seraphina. And if she could not destroy the girl's beauty, she would hide it where no one would ever see it again. The cellar beneath the Whitmore mansion had been used for storage since the house was built in 1841. It was a large space, nearly 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, with stone walls and a dirt floor. One section was a wine cellar for the Colonel's French wines. The back portion remained unused, dark, damp, a place even house servants rarely entered. This was where Helena decided to put the girl. She gave the orders to the overseer, Thomas Crenshaw, who carried them out without question. He was paid well not to ask. That evening, after the Colonel retired to his study with brandy, 2 domestic slaves came to Ruth's cabin under Crenshaw's supervision. They took Seraphina while Ruth screamed and begged. They dragged her across the yard, into the main house through the back entrance, down the wooden stairs into the cellar, and chained her to an iron ring bolted into the stone wall. Ruth tried to follow. She fought against the hands holding her back, scratching and biting like a wild animal. Crenshaw struck her across the face, knocking her down. "If you say one word about this," he told her, "I will sell you to the traders. You will never see this place again. You will never know what happened to your girl. Understand?" Ruth understood. She understood she was powerless. She understood her daughter had been swallowed by the earth. And she understood there was nothing she could do. The first night in the cellar, Seraphina did not understand what was happening. She cried for her mother until her voice gave out. She pulled at the chain until iron cut her skin and blood ran down her foot. She called for help, but her voice could not penetrate the thick stone walls and heavy wooden door. No one came. No one would come. The cellar was almost completely dark. A tiny window, no bigger than a man's hand, sat high on the wall near the ceiling. It let in a thin sliver of daylight each afternoon, just enough to tell day from night. Most of the time, Seraphina existed in total blackness. She could not see her own hands before her face. She could only feel the cold stone beneath her and the weight of the chain on her leg. Helena established a routine that would continue for 10 years. Twice a day, a kitchen slave brought a bowl of food to the cellar, cold cornmeal mush in the morning, scraps from the family's dinner in the evening. The slave was forbidden to speak to Seraphina, forbidden to bring a light, forbidden to tell anyone. Helena made it clear that violation meant immediate sale to slave traders. For the first few months, Seraphina screamed when the cellar door opened. She begged for release. She promised to be good, to be invisible. But the slaves who brought her food could not help her. They were as trapped as she was. They left the food and left, and Seraphina remained alone in darkness. Time became meaningless. Without day and night, without work to structure hours, Seraphina lost track of how long she had been imprisoned. Days blended into weeks, weeks into months. She slept when tired, ate when food appeared, cried until she had no tears left. Then slowly, something inside her began to change. The human mind is remarkably adaptable. Faced with conditions that should have driven her to madness, Seraphina's consciousness found ways to survive. She created structure from nothingness. She counted breaths in sets of 100. She recited every word she remembered her mother saying, replaying conversations until they felt real. She traced patterns on the stone floor with her fingers, memorizing shapes in the dark. She invented games, stories, entire worlds in her imagination. But the most important adaptation was learning to listen. The cellar sat beneath the main floor. Stone walls muffled most sounds, but wooden floorboards allowed certain noises through. Pressing her ear to the wall in the right spot, she began to hear voices from above, first meaningless vibrations, then words, sentences, entire conversations. She heard everything in the Whitmore household. She heard the colonel argue with business partners about debts and cotton prices. She heard Helena berate house slaves for imagined failures. She heard the 3 Whitmore sons discuss plans and secrets. She heard visitors arrive and depart, whispered confessions, shouted accusations. The house held no secrets she did not eventually discover, and she remembered everything. By her second year in the cellar, Seraphina had developed a mental catalogue of the family's most guarded information. She knew the colonel had borrowed heavily to cover hidden gambling debts. She knew the eldest son, William, had fathered a child with a free black woman and was paying for silence. She knew the middle son, Robert, stole family silver to fund his drinking. She knew the youngest, Thomas Jr., was terrified of his mother and cried himself to sleep. She also knew things about Helena, that she had pushed a house slave down the stairs, causing a miscarriage, and called it an accident, that she skimmed money into a private fund, that she forged a letter to destroy her sister's engagement 20 years earlier. This knowledge became Seraphina's most precious possession. In the darkness, where she had nothing else, she had power. Not power to escape, not yet, but the power of knowing, waiting, understanding her enemies better than they understood themselves. The years passed with agonizing slowness. Seraphina grew from a child into a young woman entirely in that cellar. Her body adapted as best it could. The chain left a permanent scar around her ankle. Her muscles weakened. Her skin grew ashen from never seeing sun. Her amber eyes developed the ability to see in near total darkness. But her mind grew stronger. Without external stimulation, she turned inward, developing a memory so precise she could recall conversations word for word years later. She taught herself to think in organized patterns, analyze information, make connections. She played mental chess against herself, developing complex strategies. Unknowingly, she was training herself to become something the Whitmore family could never have imagined. She was becoming dangerous. Her mother, Ruth, tried to reach her. For the first 3 years of imprisonment, Ruth bribed a kitchen slave to pass whispered messages through food deliveries, "Your mama loves you. Stay strong. I'm still here." These fragments kept Seraphina from losing all hope. But in the winter of 1862, the messages stopped. Seraphina waited weeks, then months. Finally, she heard the truth from a conversation between Helena and the housekeeper. Ruth had died of pneumonia, working through a fever, afraid to rest. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the slave cemetery. Seraphina did not cry. She had exhausted her tears years before. Instead, she felt something new crystallizing inside her, cold, hard, patient, like a diamond forming under pressure. It was hatred, not hot explosive anger, but the kind that could wait, plan, endure anything to achieve its purpose. And now she knew what that purpose would be. The war had begun. Seraphina listened to endless conversations through the floorboards. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, and the South celebrated. The Whitmore household was caught in patriotic fervor. The colonel gave speeches on states' rights, the sons argued over who would enlist first, Helena organized sewing circles for uniforms. They believed the war would be short and glorious, that Yankees would be defeated within months. Seraphina knew better. She heard the colonel's private conversations with less optimistic associates, whispered concerns about British neutrality, the Union naval blockade, winning a war of attrition against a more industrialized enemy. By 1862, war's reality began penetrating the plantation's isolation. Cotton prices collapsed under the blockade. William came home from Tennessee with a bullet wound and stories of carnage. Supplies grew scarce. Overseers were drafted, replaced by older men and boys who couldn't maintain control. The enslaved population grew restless, sensing change, cracks in their world. And in her cellar, Seraphina waited. She had been in darkness for 5 years and learned its most important lesson: patience was power, silence was strength. What people tried to bury had a way of rising. She was 17, had not seen sunlight since she was 7, had not heard a kind word since her mother died. She had no reason to believe her situation would change. But she knew with certainty beyond logic that her time would come. The house above was crumbling. She heard it in every worried conversation, angry argument, desperate prayer. The Whitmores were running out of money, allies, time. The world that created their wealth and power was collapsing, and they were too blind to see. But Seraphina saw. In the darkness where they had thrown her, she saw everything. And she was ready. The spring of 1864 brought changes Seraphina tracked through sounds above. Conversations grew desperate. She heard Helena argue with the colonel about selling land to cover debts. She heard William, now weakened, discuss defeat with his brothers. She heard house servants move with less caution, speak more freely. The balance of power was shifting, and everyone felt it. Food deliveries became irregular, sometimes a whole day without anything. She learned to stretch meager rations, ignore constant hunger. Her body adapted to near starvation, becoming thin and wiry. It wasn't strength, it was biological desperation. But it meant she endured when others might have died. In November 1864, she heard through the floorboards about Sherman's march, a Union general cutting a path of destruction through Georgia, burning everything from Atlanta to the sea. The terror in Helena's voice was unmistakable. If Sherman turned north into Mississippi, if Union troops reached Warren County, everything they built would be destroyed. Seraphina listened to their fear, and for the first time in 7 years, she smiled. The winter of 1864–65 was the hardest the plantation had ever known. The Confederate economy collapsed. Paper money was nearly worthless. Most slaves had run away, heading north or disappearing into chaos. Overseers had abandoned their posts. Fields lay fallow, cotton rotting unpicked. Helena reduced the household to 3 enslaved people with nowhere else to go. She dismissed the cook and worked the kitchen herself, something she had never done. Meals grew simpler. The wine cellar was emptied and sold. Silver was pawned piece by piece for necessities. The great house, once a symbol of wealth, showed neglect, paint peeling from columns, shutters hanging crooked, gardens wild with weeds. Through all this, Seraphina remained in her cellar. Helena seemed to have forgotten her, too consumed with disaster above ground to remember the girl buried alive. Food deliveries grew more sporadic, sometimes 3 or 4 days without anyone opening the cellar door. Seraphina survived on rainwater seeping through the tiny window and rats caught with bare hands in darkness. She had become something less than human and more than human at once, stripped to pure will and burning purpose. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was over. The Confederacy was dead. And somewhere in darkness beneath the Whitmore mansion, a young woman imprisoned for nearly 6 years heard the news through floorboards and knew her moment neared. Weeks after the surrender brought chaos to Warren County. Union troops moved through, enforcing terms of defeat, spreading word of emancipation. Plantation owners faced collapse. Some fled, some took their own lives, some, like the Whitmores, refused to believe their world had ended. Helena continued running her household as if nothing changed. She gave orders with the same imperious tone, spoke of the situation as temporary, a setback before proper order was restored. Her denial bordered on madness. The colonel, broken by loss, retreated to his study and drank himself into stupor daily. The sons scattered. William went to Vicksburg to salvage business interests. Robert disappeared entirely. Thomas Jr. stayed, too afraid to leave, too weak to be useful. And in the cellar, Seraphina waited. She had waited nearly 6 years. She could wait a little longer. The moment came on a warm evening in late May. Seraphina listened to sounds above as always. She heard Helena retire to her bedroom, the colonel's drunken snoring, Thomas Jr. pacing anxiously. Then she heard something new, the cellar door opening at an unusual hour. A figure descended stairs carrying a candle. The light, dim as it was, seemed blinding to her darkness-adapted eyes. She shrank back, shielding her face, thinking Helena had come to kill her, to eliminate evidence before Union authorities found it. But the voice wasn't Helena's. It was old Bessie, the kitchen slave who had warned Ruth about Seraphina's dangerous beauty years before. Bessie was 73 now, one of the few enslaved people left because she was too old and weak to run. But she had never forgotten the girl in the cellar. With the old order crumbling, she decided to act. "Girl," Bessie whispered, voice cracking with age and emotion. "The war is over. You are free. Do you understand me? You are free." Seraphina lowered her hands slowly, squinting against candlelight. She hadn't seen another human face in nearly 6 years, had almost forgotten what people looked like. Bessie's weathered features, lit by flickering flame, seemed from a dream. Bessie brought tools, a hammer, a chisel, stolen from the shed days earlier, hidden under her mattress. She knelt and worked on the iron ring holding the chain. The metal was rusted, weakened by years of cellar dampness. It took nearly an hour, but finally the ring broke free from the stone. Seraphina stood for the first time in years. Her legs barely supported her. Muscles had atrophied from disuse. She leaned against the wall, breathing heavily, feeling the strange sensation of standing upright after so long crouching and lying on cold floor. Bessie helped her up the stairs, one agonizing step at a time. The cellar door opened onto a hallway near the kitchen. Dark as it was, compared to absolute blackness of the cellar, it seemed flooded with light. Seraphina blinked, tears streaming as her eyes struggled to adjust. "You need to go," Bessie said. "Get away before they find you gone. Union soldiers are in Vicksburg. They will help you." But Seraphina didn't move toward the door. She turned and looked back into the house, toward main rooms where the Whitmore family slept. Her face, gaunt and pale from years of darkness, showed no expression, but her amber eyes burned with a light that made Bessie step back. "No," Seraphina said. Her voice was rusty from disuse, barely a whisper, but clear. "I am not leaving. Not yet." Bessie argued, staying was dangerous, Helena would kill her if she found out, the only sensible thing was to run and never look back. But Seraphina hadn't survived 6 years in that cellar by being sensible. She survived by becoming something else entirely, something that didn't run from enemies, something that hunted them. She told Bessie to go back to her cabin, pretend nothing happened, act normal in the morning, go about duties as usual. "Whatever happens," Seraphina said, "you did not see me. You do not know anything. Understand?" Bessie understood. She had lived her whole life under people who destroyed what they couldn't control. She recognized that quality in Seraphina's eyes. Whatever the girl had become in darkness, she wasn't a victim anymore. She was far more dangerous. That night, while the Whitmores slept, Seraphina explored the house she had only known through sounds. She moved silently through hallways, bare feet making no noise on wooden floors. The layout matched the map in her mind from years of listening to footsteps and voices. She knew which floorboards creaked, which doors squeaked, where everyone slept and when they woke. She found Helena's private office on the second floor, a small room for personal papers and correspondence. The door was locked, but the lock was old and poorly maintained. Seraphina worked it with a hairpin found on a dresser, using skills never taught but intuited during isolation. The lock clicked open in minutes. The office was as she imagined, a writing desk near the window, a cabinet against the wall, stacks of papers and ledgers organized with Helena's precision. Seraphina moved methodically, examining documents by thin moonlight. Her eyes, more comfortable in darkness, had no trouble reading. She found everything she wanted and more, doctored household accounts proving Helena stole from her husband, letters documenting cover-up of the slave woman's death on the stairs, correspondence with New Orleans lawyers revealing the full extent of family debts, worse than the colonel knew. And she found something unexpected, a letter from a Natchez doctor dated 1858 confirming Helena was barren and the 3 sons she claimed to have borne were actually purchased from a slave trader who dealt in light-skinned children who could pass for white. This discovery staggered her. The Whitmore sons weren't Whitmores at all, they were children of enslaved women, bought as infants and raised as white aristocrats. Helena had maintained this deception over 30 years, terrified truth would destroy her social standing and marriage. It was her most closely guarded secret. Now it belonged to Seraphina. She took the most important documents and hid them outside the house in a spot identified during exploration. Then she returned to the cellar, closing the door behind her. At dawn, she was back in familiar darkness, the chain arranged around her ankle to look still attached. No one would know she had ever left. For 2 weeks, Seraphina continued nocturnal explorations. She grew stronger each day, exercising in darkness, rebuilding wasted muscles. She ate better, taking food from the kitchen at night. Color returned to her skin. Movements became fluid, controlled. She was preparing for what was to come. During days, she listened. She learned William returned from Vicksburg with terrible news, remaining assets seized by Union authorities, the New Orleans bank demanded immediate repayment of the colonel's gambling debts, threatening legal action, creditors circled like vultures. Helena's response was to double down on denial, insist they could rebuild, old ways would return, they just needed to hold on. But her voice had a desperate, brittle quality Seraphina recognized. The mistress was losing control. Her carefully constructed world was falling apart, and she had no idea the final blow would come from beneath her own feet. Seraphina chose her moment carefully. On a Sunday morning in mid-June, while the family was at breakfast, she emerged from the cellar for the last time. She had washed in the kitchen basin and dressed in clothes taken from a storage trunk, old, slightly too large, but clean. She brushed her hair, pinned it up simply. For the first time in nearly 6 years, she looked almost human. She walked into the dining room without a sound. The family sat around the long mahogany table, picking at a meager breakfast of cornbread and weak coffee. Helena at one end, the colonel at the other, Thomas Jr. between them, eyes fixed on his plate. None noticed her at first. Then Helena looked up and screamed, a barely human sound, the scream of someone seeing a ghost, the dead rising, their worst nightmare made flesh. She knocked over her chair, stumbled backward, pressed against the wall, eyes wide with terror. The colonel stared in confusion. He never knew about the girl in the cellar. Helena kept that secret as carefully as all others. To him, this was a strange young black woman who had entered his home. His first instinct was to call for help, to have her removed. But there was no one left to call. "Good morning," Seraphina said, voice calm and clear, stronger now. "I believe we have matters to discuss." Helena found her voice. "Get out," she hissed. "Get out of my house. I will have you whipped. I will have you killed." I will. You will do nothing, Seraphina interrupted, tone almost gentle but with steel beneath. You will sit and listen, because I have things to tell your husband he needs to hear. The colonel looked between Seraphina and his wife, seeing Helena's terror and not understanding. What is the meaning of this? He demanded. Helena, who is this woman? That, Seraphina said, is an excellent question. Why don't you tell him, Mrs. Whitmore? Tell him where I have been the past 6 years. Tell him what you did to a 7-year-old child because you could not bear to look at her face. And she told him everything, the cellar, the chain, years of darkness and isolation, near starvation, rats, absence of human contact. She described it in simple, precise language without emotion, like testimony in court. The colonel listened in growing horror. Whatever his faults, complicity in slavery, he never sanctioned anything like this. He believed himself a gentleman, a man of honor. That his wife imprisoned a child in their cellar for years, tortured her with isolation and neglect, was almost beyond comprehension. Helena denied it, called Seraphina a liar, runaway, thief who broke in, but her denials were weak, contradicted by terror when Seraphina appeared. And when Seraphina produced documents from inside her dress, Helena's face went white. These are from your private office, Seraphina said. The household accounts you doctored for years. Letters about the woman who fell down the stairs. And this one is particularly interesting. She held up the letter from the Natchez doctor. Helena lunged, trying to snatch it, but Seraphina stepped aside easily. Helena crashed into the dining table, sending dishes to the floor. Your sons, Seraphina said to the colonel. They are not your sons. They are not your wife's sons. They were purchased from a slave trader in 1829, 1831, and 1834. Light-skinned children who could pass for white. Your wife has lied to you over 30 years. The colonel stared at the letter. His face went gray. He looked at Helena, sobbing now, collapsed against the table, her world crumbling. Thomas Jr. sat frozen, unable to process what he heard. Everything he believed about himself, his family, his place in the world was destroyed in minutes. He wasn't a Whitmore. He wasn't white. He was the son of a slave, purchased like property, raised in a lie. The destruction of the Whitmore family happened quickly after that morning. The colonel, confronted with his wife's deception, suffered a stroke within hours. He survived but was paralyzed on his left side, could no longer speak clearly. He spent remaining years in a wheelchair, cared for by servants now free and requiring wages the family couldn't afford. Helena was arrested 2 days later. Seraphina sent copies of incriminating documents to the Union military commander in Vicksburg, along with a detailed account of her imprisonment. Occupation authorities sought ways to demonstrate commitment to justice in the defeated South. Helena Whitmore, a wealthy white woman who imprisoned a child in a cellar for 6 years, was a perfect example. She was tried by military tribunal, sentenced to 15 years in prison. She died of typhoid fever in her cell less than 2 years later. The 3 Whitmore sons scattered. William, the eldest, could not accept truth about his origins. 3 weeks after the revelation, he put a pistol in his mouth and pulled the trigger. Robert, the middle son, disappeared, never heard from again. Some said he went west to California, others that he drank himself to death in a New Orleans boarding house. Thomas Jr. had a different reaction. He sought out Seraphina after everything fell apart and begged for information about his real mother. She could tell him little, records incomplete, trail cold after so many years, but she told what she knew, and she watched something change in his eyes. He moved north to Philadelphia, lived as a black man the rest of his life, working as a teacher in a school for freedmen's children. The Whitmore plantation was seized by the federal government and redistributed to formerly enslaved people under General Sherman's Special Field Orders No. 15. The Great White House was divided into apartments for 3 black families. Cotton fields were parceled into small farms. The world James and Helena Whitmore built was not just destroyed, it was transformed into something they would have found unimaginable, a community of free people living on land they owned, building lives that belonged to them. And Seraphina walked away. She left Warren County in summer 1865, headed north. She had no money, possessions, family left alive. But she had something more valuable. She had survived. She had triumphed. She had taken everything from those who tried to destroy her. And she did it not with violence, but with truth. The secrets they tried so hard to keep became weapons of their destruction. She made her way to Memphis, then St. Louis, then Chicago. She worked as domestic servant, seamstress, cook. She saved carefully, spending only necessary to survive. She taught herself to read and write using discarded newspapers and books from houses where she worked. The same mind that kept her sane in darkness, memorized years of conversations, mastered written word easily. By 1870, Seraphina saved enough to open a small boarding house in Chicago's growing black community. She ran it 23 years, providing clean rooms and hot meals to black travelers turned away from white establishments. She never married, never had children. When asked about her past, she said only she grew up in Mississippi and left after the war. She didn't speak of the cellar, the Whitmores. That chapter was closed. But she kept one thing from those years. In a small wooden box under a floorboard in her bedroom, she kept the chain that bound her ankle nearly 6 years. Iron rusted, links weakened, but recognizable. Sometimes late at night, she took it out, held it, felt its weight, remembered. She didn't keep it from sentiment. She kept it as a reminder of what humans could do to each other, what she endured and overcame, that no matter how dark darkness became, there was always a way back to light. Seraphina Drake died in Chicago on February 14, 1912. She was 60. The obituary in the Chicago Defender described her as a respected businesswoman, pillar of her community. It mentioned her boarding house, charitable work with newly arrived Southern migrants, her quiet dignity and strength. It didn't mention Mississippi, the Whitmores, the cellar. But there were those who knew. Old Bessie, who lived until 1889, told the story to grandchildren before she died. Some formerly enslaved from Whitmore Plantation shared whispered accounts of the girl who emerged from darkness and destroyed her captors with truth alone. The story passed down generations, changing as oral histories do, becoming more legend than fact. Perhaps that's fitting, because Seraphina Drake's story isn't just one woman's. It's the story of everyone buried alive by injustice who found a way to rise. It's the story of secrets oppressors try to hide and truth that always surfaces. It's the story of beauty that couldn't be destroyed, spirit that couldn't be broken, vengeance as patient as it was complete. Helena Whitmore tried to bury Seraphina in darkness because she couldn't bear to look at her. She thought hiding the girl away meant she didn't exist. She thought chains, stone walls, years of isolation would destroy what she could never possess. She was wrong. The darkness didn't destroy Seraphina, it forged her. It made her sharper, stronger, more patient than any enemy imagined. It taught her to listen when others spoke carelessly, remember when others forgot. It taught her that cruelty of the powerful is built on secrets, and secrets are the most fragile foundations. In the end, Helena Whitmore was undone not by force but truth, not by violence but patience, not by hatred but the simple unstoppable power of a human being who refused to be erased. She spent years trying to hide Seraphina from the world. But the world finds what is hidden. And sometimes what emerges from darkness is more powerful than what put it there. This is the story of Seraphina Drake, prisoner of beauty, girl in the cellar, woman who waited 10 years in darkness and emerged to bring light to those who wronged her. Her story was buried over a century, lost in the ocean of suffering that was American slavery. But stories like hers surface. They rise through cracks in history. They demand to be heard because truth cannot be chained forever. And beauty, real beauty, beauty of the human spirit, can survive anything. 6 years of darkness, a lifetime of injustice, determined cruelty of those who fear what they cannot control. Seraphina Drake knew this. She learned it in the cellar beneath Whitmore Mansion, in endless darkness where she should have been destroyed. She carried that knowledge the rest of her life. And now, more than a century after her death, her story carries it forward still. Some chains are iron. Others are secrets and lies. Both can be broken. Both will be broken. It is only a matter of time. And Seraphina had all the time in the world.